The government of Sri Lanka has so far resisted the setting up of a reconciliation process that involves looking into truth and accountability issues. They say this will not be useful. The topic has become a controversial one, involving affected communities, human rights groups, the diaspora as well as the international community. We spoke to advise on reconciliation to His Excellency the President, Professor Rajiva Wijesinha, to find out more about the government's stance.
Professor Wijesinha, it's good to have you with us on Connections. In your opinion, how effective has the government been in giving momentum to a process of reconciliation in the country?
Well, I think some elements it's done extremely well, but others it could do better. I think if you look back at the situation 2 years ago, there were many charges against the government being circulated, that it was going to delay on resettlement, it was going to delay on rehabilitation, where people went back towards a mess. And I think on all those, government has done extraordinarily well. For instance, the resettlement process has been very, very quick, quicker than anywhere else in the world. The rehabilitation has been fantastic in the sense that of the near 11,000 cadres, near 12,000, most of them are now back home after basic rehabilitation. And of course, the infrastructure development has been very good considering the lack of stuff in the north in the past. But I think we need to do better, as I've always said, on what I call human resources development. You know, we should be more solid on education. My simple example for this is the schools are functioning well in terms of buildings, very good buildings for most schools. I've been to quite a few areas. You have students with uniforms, with books, but they're lacking teachers in things like science and maths and English. And for the 21st century, those subjects have to be done pretty well. Now, it's true that in the rest of the country also there are shortfalls in this, but there should be much more concerted action to move forward on things like that, on microcredit for former combatants and for others to propel employment, development of cooperatives, things like that we could do better.
Moving on, linked to reconciliation is the government's LLRC process. Now I'm going to ask you, the much awaited report is about to be finalized. And first of all, we are familiar with the term truth and reconciliation, but the government decided to call their commission the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. Why do you think this decision was taken, and do you think it is possible to still address the issue of reconciliation without taking the truth aspect?
Well, you see, here's a fundamental flaw in what I would call stereotypical Western thinking. What Sri Lanka needs is reconciliation and moving forward. We are often given examples of backward-looking reconciliation, and the most obvious one of this is the South African. But you see, people have completely forgotten the differences between South Africa and Sri Lanka. South Africa was a situation where you had a very wicked, racist regime, and they lost. Okay? Now, after they lost, the concern was that the new government, led by Nelson Mandela, would have to put up with recriminations and punishments. And maybe those white guys deserved it. But Nelson Mandela said, look, let's excuse them. If they confess to having done wrong, we will forgive them and let them be part of our society. Now, in Sri Lanka, the situation was very different. The bad guys in Sri Lanka lost the war. Most of the really vicious decision makers were dead. So why should we engage in what I would call recrimination against them? You know, if you had a proper, let's say, punishing scenario, some of those poor kids who were being rehabilitated would have to be punished because they killed us. They were child soldiers or otherwise. But we know they were forced to it. So we are perhaps in a more forgiving mood, which we have necessarily to be. Because these bad guys who lost, the really bad guys, are no longer there. So the West wants something that will end up in punishing the good guys, which is ridiculous. I mean, I'm not for a moment saying that some people in our armed forces may have committed excesses, but it was clearly not policy. We need to look forward. The lessons learned is to do with, I think, the more important aspect of why this turned into such violence, because of state policies that seem discriminatory. In some respects, they were not intended to be discriminatory, but they certainly had a bad effect. And I think the Tamil people of Sri Lanka need to be assured that they are full citizens and will have equal rights with everybody else.
Leads me to my next question, Professor. The much awaited LLRC report is finally due this month. And so what do you hope to see in it? And how do you think the government will respond to these recommendations?
Well, from my point of view, the most important thing is much more what they did in their interim report. Measures that would make the Tamil people in the north feel that they are fully integrated into Sri Lanka. And that involves things like legal mechanisms, that involves things like information mechanisms, it also involves things like employment. I think those are vital, and as I've said before, we are doing reasonably well on them, but we can do much better. The second area is, I hope, addressing some of the political causes. Plus, I think we haven't looked seriously enough at what made a political problem a terrorist problem. And while I think it had something to do with the intransigence of some of the people who stuck with the LTT to the end, the really brutal terrorists, I think we also have to take into account what happened in 77, 81 and 83. Repeated attacks on Tamils by what were clearly government-sponsored goons, the burning of the Jaffna Public Library, all those emotionally rousing incidents, which is one reason why so many people in the diaspora are so bitter, because we have to remember that they were treated very badly. And I think there should be accountability for that. Unfortunately, when President Kumaratunga did her own exploration of what happened in 83, it turned into what I would call a rent-seeking exercise. People were given compensation without any report on what had really happened. So I hope we look into that as well. So the final element is what I think the West is waiting for, which is for us to sort of say, oh my God, beating our breasts and saying we did terrible things. We did not do terrible things. We fought a war against a terrible enemy in a very civilized fashion, with much fewer civilian casualties than in any other attack on terrorists. But there are certain incidents where it seems there is a prima facie case. I have often mentioned the white flag case. I think we should look into that a bit more carefully.
We are talking about moving forward as a country. What about Sri Lankans in the diaspora? They still tend to be portrayed by state media and even on political platforms as LTT supporters. Now, does this impact on genuine efforts by the diaspora to get involved in Sri Lanka's development?
I think you're putting the cart before the horse. I don't think it's a question of the state media. There may be individuals. It is a question of what the extremist elements in the diaspora have been saying.
Now, like you say, there are extremists, and at the same time, Professor, there are moderates too in the diaspora, but it's a monolithic group. So, how should the government engage with the diaspora at this point of time?
Well, I think there should be more coherence about it. Individual ambassadors are trying, but there should be a very solid policy. You know, one of my big objections is that our foreign ministry never uses think tanks to work out policy. In the last few months, I've had very close discussions with our ambassador in the UK, in Brussels, in Geneva, in Rome, and in Paris, of course, the Anja Tilaka. All of them are really super people. At the moment, we have 5 top thinking ambassadors. But they never even get to meet with each other. There is no coherence. There is no unit in Colombo that will actually organize programs for them. I mean, the lack of thinking is astonishing. I've been trying. I told Professor Pires he wanted me at one stage to help with writing things. I said, you know, I can help to write, but that's not the point. I mean, I'm an old man. If we can actually get people together, I can train them for the future. We need a think tank. I mean, fairly recently, I think International Alert is sending some young MPs. They brought them together for me to talk to them. I mean, I can do this on a wider scale. I can do it for the foreign military people. But when I asked to do this, some people responded positively. Foreign ministry is very, very slow because they don't have a policy of planning. And I think that is not fair on our excellent ambassadors. One of them is career, the others are all non-career, but they're the top of their rank. And they're not given the support they need. So I think that is an area where we have to do much better. And if we fail to make links with the diaspora, we will only have ourselves to blame.
And Professor, now this series Connections is trying to engage with the Sri Lankan diaspora and see how they could contribute towards post-war development and reconstruction. But as we touched on, there are certain extremist groups and very negative perceptions about the diaspora here in Sri Lanka as well. How could this situation be addressed by a program like Connections?
Well, I think one of the things Connections should do is ask for concrete support for initiatives from both Sinhalese and Tamils abroad for the people who suffered most. For instance, one of the things I'm hoping to do with my decentralized budget is to set up a fund to act in lieu of a guarantee for private banks to give microcredit. And commercial bank has already promised to match those funds. Now, why can't the diaspora, both Sinhala and Tamil, contribute to this? It would be administered by government people, but the business side would be looked after by the bank, which understands business better than you and I do.
You don't see a diaspora having a role to play, say, on a political platform?
I don't think they should, because the political people in the diaspora still live in the past. You see, what we need is to encourage the diaspora to have a social role. How do you help their fellow citizens and maybe their fellows, the Tamils, to play a greater social and economic role? You see, many of these people who went abroad did well. How can they help their people in Sri Lanka to also do well? You know, one very simple thing, the Minister of Higher Education, which is one of the most dynamic in the country, is trying to bring our university system into the 21st century. Unfortunately, for political reasons, it's being opposed. The JVP might oppose it honestly but foolishly because of their old-fashioned ideas. Some people in the UNP, not all, some are very sane, but some may oppose it for political reasons. We should all get together and show how it will benefit the deprived people of the children of this country and get the diaspora to support that. Not to get involved in political theory, because their political theories are outdated. They live in, understandably perhaps, they live in what happened in 1983 when they were attacked and attacked badly. As I said, we should make it clear that that type of thing will never be repeated. But the support should come for economic and social ideas.
It was wonderful having you on the program today. Thank you for sharing your views and insights on a number of issues.